Jafari noch nicht unter uns ist, möchte ich gerne mit Ihnen beginnen. Ich möchte Sie kurz vorstellen. Sie waren als Vize-Minister für Industrie und Handel Mitglied der letzten Regierung von Präsident Ghani. Sie haben Afghanistan bislang nicht verlassen. Worauf setzen Sie zukünftig Ihre Hoffnung? Wo sehen Sie zukünftig politische Einflussmöglichkeiten? Wir danken Ihnen sehr für Ihre persönlichen Schilderungen, Ihre Erfahrungen über die letzten 3 Monate in Afghanistan. Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you so much. First of all, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim wa bihi nasta'in. I'm very, very glad and happy to be joining in this session and sharing some of the thoughts and reflections from my side. I feel humbled. I feel, again, very happy to be with all of you. And Jazakallah to everyone and who contributed in organizing this important event and this important talk. Since the host, when initially was contacting me and talking to me, they requested that I should share more of a personal account of what happened on August 15 and life before and after that. And I'll try to do that. However, I would like to focus specifically on just maybe 4 points, which is life before August 15 and life after August 15. But at the same time, I would also like to reflect upon couple of points in terms of participations and the ecosystems that we have had in Afghanistan, are still there in parts and parcels. So as everyone know, my name is Muhammad Sulaiman bin Shah. I was the Deputy Minister for Industry and Commerce until Kabul fell on August 15. Kabul falling once again, but to be honest with you, in my complete faith and confidence, I can say that Kabul will rise again. And August 15 has been probably just one of the many, many days and dates we have had in our history. And I think our history is full of, events and incidents just like these. And maybe we are coming at an intersection again. And this is an honest thought shared with everyone. My background, I think I should also maybe, mention a little bit what I was doing before August 15, what exactly I was busy with. But I think also it's very important that I was raised as a refugee in Peshawar. I was born in Kabul, but back in 1990s, my parents were also forced to take their kids and leave Afghanistan and be refugees in Pakistan for more than 20 years. Now, back in 1990s, when the government was collapsing, my father was a army officer. He was serving in the army, and it was a very, I think, interesting in some way an experience on August 15, because August 15, 2021, I was part of the government and working for the government, and that day Kabul fell again. So it's very interesting for me personally. Now to the question why I haven't left Afghanistan. I think I thought the same, that it's a historic day in our history, in our political history. And I'm sure that there are going to be other many historic days in our political history in the future as well. But I was not surprised seeing what happened on August 15. And I think nobody should be surprised, because it was the result of an agreement that was signed in Doha 2 years ago. So maybe one can argue or contemplate that we should not have seen what happened on August 15 in a way, because it was not planned to, it was not agreed to by any party. however it happened. And so if it would have happened in some other form or way, the end result would have been the same outcome that was expected out of Doha Agreement. And so I think, for young Afghans who are still in the country, this is not the end of the world for us. And what we saw in Doha and during that process, I think our awareness for the future of Afghanistan has increased. And I think that's something which gives me energy every day when I wake up, when I go out and roam around. So one of the good things that has happened after August 15 is the sense of security to some extent. Perfect. And so my point earlier, when I was trying to give you a description of how August 15 came in my life, it was my just 6 months in my office as deputy minister, and before that as advisor to the minister. So I'm educated and trained in economic and commercial diplomacy from the Middlebury Institute in California, United States. I went there as a Fulbright scholar in 2016, and I spent a year in California and then 6 months in Washington, DC, going to George Washington and Georgetown universities and attending classes. So primarily, I'm educated in economic diplomacy, and my focus today, I think, would be more on the ecosystem side and what is it that we have lost in that spectrum, or if we have really lost it all. So I'll try to present my humble ideas here in parts and parcel. I think when August 15, I was scheduled to see the president at 10:30 to 10:45 minutes. And earlier in the morning, when I was going to the palace, it was just a normal day in Kabul when I was going to the office. And I could sense there was this weird calmness in the city. There was not a lot of mayhem and noise by then. But as soon as the events started folding around noon and in the afternoon, the entire city was filled with mayhem, and it was really a historic moment for me as well. When I arrived in the palace, the president was busy reading his book in the Haram Sarai Palace, and I was escorted by his protocol and his team, and I was getting ready to meet him and brief him about food security in Afghanistan, because for almost 90 days, my team and the private sector, we were trying to work out to make sure that we have enough food stocks in the country for the winters, and also if there is, a new wave of war starts. And it was very obvious because in the last few weeks and months, as you saw, a number of provinces fell, and our routes to different countries and even ports fell. And we shared that same concern at the World Trade Organization 2 weeks before Kabul fell, kind of raising our voice of how a port can fail in terms of, when we are talking about regional cooperation and what's so not. The main idea around that time was, for my team and I, that we have secure supply routes and we have people who would be willing to invest their money, the private sector, to make sure that the stocks level are there in terms of any happenings or any events. And so I was prepared to go and brief the president. Unfortunately, our meeting didn't happen at all. The schedule, changed around 10:45. I was asked that he got busy with another meeting, and so I had to wait even a few more minutes. But by the time it was probably around 11:15, 11:30. Around that time, I don't remember the exact minute, but there were gunfires outside the palace. And we could literally hear the gunshots in the vicinity of Afghanistan Royal Gardens, the premise that is called. And it was the time when his personal security kind of reassessed itself. They wore the bulletproof jackets, and they kind of prepared for a situation. They were trying to prepare for a situation which I was not aware of what that was at that particular moment. And so when the gunshots were fired, everybody was asked to leave the vicinity, and every personnel of the palace, including guests and everybody, were asked to leave, and they were evacuated, around noon, before noon, and even the afternoon. So probably the evacuation was happening from the palace around 11, 12, and then probably until 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. and maybe even later. And so when I was asked to leave, I sat back in my car, and we came back to my office, which is on the Sulaiman road, because I was receiving a number of calls saying there's a lot of mayhem in the city and a lot of distress on the streets. And I could literally see it from my car. And it took almost 2 hours to get back to the office and kind of see how my team members are and if everybody is in safety or not. So I went there, I met the security, everybody was evacuated by then. We did the emergency protocol, and because I was the acting minister on that day, because my boss was away. So in some terms, I was the in charge for the Ministry of Industry and Commerce. And so my job was to make sure that the protocols are met, and we do whatever emergency situation protocols were given to us by our security, by our health, and other disaster management personnel as well. And so once I was done with that protocol, I just went home, back to my apartment, and I started monitoring the situation. It was a terrifying 2 weeks, I would say, a terrifying 2 weeks in terms that nobody exactly knew what was happening. And so that distress and that confusion and clarity impacted Afghans in the country psychologically. And I think it's very obvious, and I don't have to go into the details of what you might have seen at the airport and what was happening at the airport, and how people were literally, just running away, fleeing the country. Thousands and thousands of young men and women were ready just to exit the country. And partially, if we see this in a bigger lens, in a bigger context, is of course the sense for security and the fear associated with Taliban as a group, is a political group, and their past rule in Kabul or Afghanistan in general. But at the same time, we have also to see that, and this stands true even now, that Afghanistan did not provide a sustainable socio-economic foundation for the young Afghan men and women. And I think that was the primary reason, even in peace times, even in times where we had an elected government, let's say 2014, just because the United States forces were withdrawing from Afghanistan, we saw a tremendous migration and brain drain. Afghan young men and women, they were leaving the country. I remember there were probably more than 150,000 people who left the country around that time too. So economic migration or socioeconomic migration probably is not only caused just because the sense of security, or just because there's war or there's a threat. Of course, there are specific cases and special cases where people still feel threatened, where people still feel, a sense of insecurity for their lives, for their property, and many other things that they value in life. Even, just reveal thoughts. but at the same time, there are still millions and millions of Afghans who are living in Afghanistan and are unable to leave. And there are people who just don't want to leave. It's their country, it's their soil, it's their land. And no matter how and who rules Afghanistan, they still would opt to stay in Afghanistan. And I think this is probably one of the biggest unfortunate thing happened in the last 20 years was that Afghanistan was seen limited to major urban centers. People thought Kabul was probably the whole picture of Afghanistan, or even small towns or neighborhoods in Kabul city for some people were the entire Afghanistan. And I think that's myopic, and that's not a very rational lens to see Afghanistan and the affairs of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is beyond Kabul, Herat, Mazar, Jalalabad, and the 5 major zones. Afghanistan is beyond that. Afghanistan is beyond so many headlines that we can see today. And unfortunately, the misinformation and the hatred now that is spreading in the social media is very unfortunately. I can see, just so many channels and outlets and accounts who, are still trying to, hope for continuing the war. I think that's not in the benefit of anybody. If war was a solution, we had, the world's biggest army with biggest resources. They were here for 20 years and they fought with whatever might they had and still lost the war. And I do not say this. It's something, which is very obvious and, is quoted and written about every day in many international respected outlets or news channels. Or by people who are respected. I consider myself just as a student of affairs in Afghanistan, but somehow trying to give up my perspective. And so, to me, the question that what is lost in Afghanistan is a difficult one, because it's very hard to contemplate what was achieved and what was lost and how it was lost. Or sometimes it feels why this, becomes a very obsessed question for us to just see where are we losing. I think, it's very important to see where do we lose and where do we fix the future discourse. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we also see what was achieved and what was built and what is there and still there in Afghanistan. And I think there are very few people who would still want to, show that solid few things, if not a lot of things. Maybe there are not a lot of things which are really, really good in Afghanistan.
Nun ist leider Herr bin Shah, glaube ich, wieder seine Leitung getrennt worden. Herr bin Shah, können Sie mich noch hören?
I think there was a tremendous amount of momentum for progress in different areas and for political participation. I think that is slowed down, but we cannot just explicitly say that there is no participation at all. No, there is still participation. There are economic hurdles, there is humanitarian catastrophe, there is migration issues happening. There's so much happening, so much distress, and of course, political tension in terms of a future and certainty for future. But at the same time, there is still participation. If you go out in major urban centers, there's still some level of activities. But at the same time, we have to understand that for a lot other people, the conditions or circumstances to continue life in Afghanistan have become extremely difficult. And this difficulty has to be seen from many, many angles. It is the economic hardship. It is the harsh winter. It is the drought. It is the inability to, do economic activity and feed kids or bring food to the table. It can be, many different things for many, many people. I met artists a few weeks ago who are still in Kabul, and they were telling me that they are worried to pay the tuition fee for their kids. And that's their only worry. They're not worried about anything else. So what I'm trying to present here humbly is that there is, of course, a sense of loss, a huge sense of loss, but it's also very hard to measure, and say explicitly that everything is lost. I think everything is not lost. I think what we have lost, categorically speaking, and big loss, I would say, is 4 million, more than 4 million kids are out of school now. I feel that is the biggest loss after August 15. Before August 15, as you all know, we lost precious lives. Afghans lost precious lives. I mentioned this earlier as well. Our allies, our partners, so many people were killed in the last 20 years in the name of war on terror, of course, and fighting terrorism, of course. And at the same time, we can see now after the Doha Agreement that that number has significantly reduced. We are not losing more than 400 people every day now, but at the same time, we are losing people just because there is drought. We are losing people, we are losing kids just because they are malnutrition and they do not have enough food to get and to eat. And bad health conditions. You see, COVID-19 shook the entire world, and it also had effects in Afghanistan. And so whatever little or weak we had developed in the past 1 year to battle or tackle challenges of COVID-19, they are fragile now again, because they're not able to receive sustainable funding. They're not able to receive support now. And it's a big piece that I would like to come again and point out more of the things. So the third point that I would like to mention in terms of loss is that girls are unable to go to high schools. Education has been hit very hard, I would say. We, in the last 20 years, I think our biggest achievement was that millions and millions of kids were able to go to schools. And now, even if there is a partial limitation on access to education, I believe is going to be our biggest loss. The weak, corrupt, or ill system, whatever ill system or institutions that we have had in Afghanistan were built, were doing some work. And so that momentum is not there because initially people were afraid, and they're still afraid to come back to offices, even though amnesty is announced. And a lot of people has some sort of positive attitude towards this amnesty, and they are able to go back to offices. But there are a number of other people who are not able to join offices, go back to their duty stations, just because they do not feel safe and they do not feel comfortable enough to continue whatever they wanted to continue. So that momentum that we had developed, even if it was weak, is lost. A third point, or maybe final point, that I would like to make is about the ecosystems. Ecosystems were quite important for us in the last 20 years. If you see, we had an ecosystem for political processes and participation. We had an ecosystem for economic and commercial diplomacy. We had an ecosystem for education in terms of teachers trained, schools built, kids had access to schools. In terms of health, we also had another ecosystem. And also one of the most challenging and probably one of the most important one in regional connectivity was the energy and infrastructure or transportation ecosystem that Afghanistan has developed. Now, one can see how these ecosystems are being affected overall, just because there is a change in rule in Kabul, or we are talking about post-August 15 arena. I think there are still, strong components of some of the ecosystems still available. If you look at the, infrastructure or transportation, we still have the systems, we still have the infrastructure, we still have, private sector operational, functional, working. At the same time, if we look at the health ecosystem, we still have, functional, clinics or hospitals, but they are challenged with medicines, they are challenged with staff. And so some parts and parcels of the ecosystems are there. And I think it is very, very important to preserve those gains and those achievements and, start building on those. Should be the priority for everybody, should be priority for the political leaders of Afghanistan, should be priority for the international community, and should be priority for everybody to not lose those packets and parcels of weak ecosystems that we have had. In terms of economic and commercial diplomacy, which is very important and close to my heart, because I was part of the economic and commercial diplomacy for the last 10 years. I was part of the foreign direct investment team, and then I was part of the trade policy team. And then finally, as a deputy minister, was quite involved in the economic and commercial diplomacy affairs of Afghanistan. Right now, the momentum is just above zero. So that ecosystem has been hit also significantly. We saw that the new rulers or the new government had visits to Uzbekistan and Pakistan, and they discussed some economic issues, but there are no tangible results. And importantly than this is the collapse of financial and banking system and the level of economic diplomacy or commercial diplomacy it requires to tackle issues when it comes to negotiations with IMF or the World Bank or any other agencies to reinstate whatever we had in terms of that financial ecosystem, or let's say unfreezing assets in other parts that require huge attention and a tremendous amount of skill sets to negotiate with others, with regional countries, with donor organizations, with everybody. And an important element that we have to remember, apart from trade or economic diplomacy, is our energy diplomacy. We import a lot of energy from our neighbors, and it has made us sort of dependent on those resources that come from Central Asia. And we have also had and still having really important projects such as the TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, gas pipeline, the CASA 1000 electricity lines, the TAP power lines, and many, many other regional economic projects that require hours and hours of diplomacy, hours and hours of technical work and negotiations to make sure that these projects are implemented. Because no matter who rules, bureaucracy is there and will be there. And in the modern world, when you have to sit on the table and negotiate deals with your neighbors and international countries, it's not the same. It's not just like we used to do it in the 90s or 70s or 40s. The 2021 diplomacy has completely changed. It has many, many angles embedded now. And I feel that there is absolutely no momentum when it comes to our economic or commercial diplomacy bubble. And we are losing every day a lot of value just because we are not pursuing our economic goals. So I think this is, just a basic overview of what I wanted to give out. I would appreciate questions. I think I've spoken enough, more than enough, I would say today. And my apologies for any inconveniences or any remarks that might be, offensive in any way. Thank you so much.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, lieber Herr bin Shah. Ich möchte Sie zum Schluss noch um eine kurze Bemerkung bitten zur Frage, Wie sehen Sie denn die Chancen oder wie würden Sie die Möglichkeiten beurteilen für das, was Sie uns gerade gesagt haben, was Sie gerne bewahren möchten, was Sie weiter aufbauen möchten? Sehen Sie da Chancen, dies mit der jetzigen Taliban-Regierung zu verhandeln, Afghanistan dafür weiter voranzubringen? Ich bitte Sie hier um ein ganz kurzes abschließendes Statement.
I think in terms of, so there are two angles that we have to look at that. The Taliban are the new rulers in Kabul, and this is a reality now. This is a fact. And so one angle would be to, accept this fact and navigate and continue navigating whatever pursuit the young Afghans have, the young Afghan men and women have. In terms of what is it that should be preserved, I think there's a lot that needs preservation. There's a lot that needs, more care and nurturing. There is so much that does not deserve abandoning. Afghanistan in the last 20 years have achieved so much in sports, media, entrepreneurship, business, commerce, education, the internet world, and so on and so forth. I can literally talk for hours and hours, what kind of economic and investment opportunities we have in Afghanistan. And the biggest resource that we have is our people in our communities. And I think in the last 20 years, there's a complete transformation, in people. How do they think? How do they perceive? I believe they are more aware. I believe they are more knowledgeable. It's very true that, they are having a hard and tough time right now. But at the same time, there is so much that they have achieved and they want to preserve that, it's not even a question to abandon Afghanistan.
Okay, ganz herzlichen Dank nach Kabul, lieber Herr bin Shah. Wir möchten an dieser Stelle hier, und das war auch so nach dem Beitrag von Frau Khafari, wenn sie jetzt bei uns gewesen wäre, diese als sehr, sehr persönliche Schilderungen nicht unmittelbar an dieser Stelle diskutieren. Ich bitte Sie um ein wenig Geduld. Wir nehmen das mit in die Diskussion am Ende nach den beiden anderen Beiträgen. Frau Khafari ist bislang nicht zu uns hinzugekommen. Insofern müssen wir uns da noch ein wenig gedulden, ob das gelingt. Ansonsten fahren wir gleich im Programm fort. Aber wir werden in der Zwischenzeit jetzt ganz kurz eine Pause machen. Die steht uns, glaube ich, nach mehr als einer Stunde in diesem digitalen Meeting schon zu. Wir machen jetzt eine Viertelstunde Pause und sehen uns dann 39, also 40 spätestens wieder hier in diesem Raum. 16:40 Uhr. So, meine Damen und Herren, ich hoffe, Sie sind alle wieder aus der Pause zurück, gestärkt und für die nächsten Beiträge aufnahmefähig. Es ist uns leider nicht gelungen, mit Sarifa Khafari in Kontakt zu kommen. Wir hoffen mal, dass ihr nicht irgendetwas dazu zugestoßen ist, sodass sie gar nicht die Möglichkeit hatte, sich jetzt bei uns einzuloggen. Eigentlich war alles gut vorbereitet. Aber so ist es nun mal in den virtuellen und digitalen Untiefen. Damit müssen wir leider umgehen. Wir fahren jetzt fort im Programm, haben die beiden Beiträge von Emran Feroz und Michael Sample und danach öffnen wir sofort für Sie für Fragen auch an Herrn bin Shah und die anderen beiden. Lieber Emran Feroz, ich hoffe, dass Sie jetzt, ja, ich sehe Sie, das ist gut und ich hoffe, dass bei Ihnen die Internetverbindung auch stabil bleibt.
Okay.
Lieber Herr Feroz, ich will Sie ganz kurz zumindest ankündigen, für alle, die Sie nicht kennen. Sie begleiten ja jetzt schon als Journalist, Autor und als Blogger die Entwicklung in Afghanistan in den letzten 20 Jahren sehr intensiv und mit einem immer sehr kritischen Blick. Noch vor der Machtübernahme der Taliban ist Ihr vielbeachtetes letztes Buch, Der längste Krieg, 20 Jahre War on Terror, erschienen. Jetzt aus heutiger Sicht mit Blick auf die letzten gut 3 Monate Herrschaft der Taliban in Afghanistan, wie sieht Ihre Zwischenbilanz da aus und wagen Sie auch einen Blick in die Zukunft für uns? Danke Ihnen.
Vielen Dank. Das Buch ist tatsächlich pünktlich zu dieser Machtübernahme erschienen, war so nicht geplant, aber ja, hat sich dann so aufgrund der Umstände ergeben. Ich würde gern, also das wird jetzt auch ein sehr kurzer, kompakter Input von mir. Es gibt natürlich viele Dinge zu besprechen, vielleicht dann mehr in der Fragerunde, aber in den nächsten 15 Minuten würde ich mich gern auf ein paar wesentliche Dinge konzentrieren und das Ganze nochmal zuallererst rekonstruieren, was eigentlich überhaupt Mitte August passiert ist. Im vergangenen August war es nämlich so, dass viele Menschen, viele Beobachter des Afghanistan-Krieges, viele Menschen auch in der Blase in Kabul, die vorhin auch ein bisschen schon angeteast wurde von Herrn bin Shah, von der Realität eingeholt wurden, als die Taliban erstmal im Dominoeffekt zahlreiche Provinzen erobern konnten, Provinzhauptstädte, und eben dann auch ohne großen Widerstand die Hauptstadt übernommen haben. Und ich möchte an dieser Stelle nochmal das wiederholen, was ich jetzt in den letzten Wochen und Monaten immer wieder gesagt habe, und zwar, dass vieles davon überhaupt nicht überraschend war. Der Dominoeffekt, der in den Provinzhauptstädten stattgefunden hat, war absehbar, weil sich in den Distrikten rundherum die Taliban schon seit Jahren aufgehalten haben, dort aus dem Schatten agiert haben, dort regiert haben eigentlich, ihre Parallelstrukturen erfolgreich errichtet haben. Und jeder, der in diesen Distrikten unterwegs war, in diesen Provinzen, wusste das auch. Und Ähnliches war auch in Kabul der Fall. Ich erinnere mich, als ich im Jahr 2019 im Kabuler Distrikt Musei unterwegs war, gab es damals schon eine massive Taliban-Präsenz 20 Minuten vom Präsidentenpalast entfernt. Und de facto befand sich dieser Distrikt zum damaligen Zeitpunkt schon unter Taliban-Kontrolle. Aber man hat sich mit diesen Realitäten einfach nicht auseinandersetzen wollen. Eine andere interessante Sache, die jetzt vor kurzem erst aufgearbeitet wurde, da gab es einen ganz schönen Text im Wall Street Journal. Dieser Text ist, glaube ich, der ist in dieser Woche erschienen. Da wurde nochmal deutlich, wie geschickt und gezielt die Taliban in den letzten Jahren und Monaten auch die afghanische Hauptstadt infiltriert hatten. Und das Bild, das viele Analysten auch von dieser Gruppierung gezeichnet hatten und das viele Beobachter immer wieder rekonstruierten, war ein falsches. Und zwar das Bild des bärtigen Mannes, der irgendwo sich hinter dem Berg verschanzt hat und da versucht, barbarisch irgendwie das Land zu übernehmen, mit Sandalen und ohne jegliche Ausrüstung und so. Viele Taliban-Kämpfer hatten sich in Kabul glatt rasiert in den bekannten Institutionen verschanzt und haben sich dann zum richtigen Zeitpunkt, sprich Mitte August, entblößt. Und auch ansonsten haben die Taliban in technologischer Hinsicht, in kriegstechnischer Hinsicht in den letzten Jahren sehr viel gelernt. Und auch diese Fehlanalysen, die haben dazu geführt, dass man dann Mitte August davon überrumpelt war. Ein weiterer wichtiger Vergleich, ich weiß nicht, ob er schon gebracht wurde, aber ich denke, er ist erwähnenswert, ist die Tatsache, dass man den Abzug der Amerikaner im vergangenen August mit dem Abzug der Sowjets 1989 immer wieder verglichen hat. In den letzten Monaten, also sprich vor dem Abzug oder auch vielleicht in den letzten Jahren. Und es ist schon ein sehr beachtlicher Vergleich, weil wir müssen bedenken, als der letzte sowjetische Soldat Afghanistan verlassen hat, hat sich das kommunistische Regime von Dr. Najibullah noch 2 Jahre halten können und wurde erst 1992 von den Mujahideen gestürzt. Viele haben mit einem ähnlichen Szenario gerechnet, jetzt im Zuge des War on Terror der Amerikaner, so dass man gedacht hat, dass die Regierung von Ashraf Ghani nach 20 Jahren ausländischer Besatzung, nicht nur nach 10 Jahren wie in den 80er Jahren, wie das bei den Sowjets der Fall war, sondern nach 20 Jahren wenigstens in der Lage sein wird, sich ein wenig länger zu halten. Das war mitnichten der Fall. Am selben Tag ist der Präsident geflüchtet. Wir haben die Details schon mitbekommen. Sie wurden wahrscheinlich auch immer wieder jetzt auch erwähnt. Und die korrupte Elite ist geflüchtet und man hat gesehen, wie oberflächlich eigentlich die Errungenschaften der letzten 20 Jahre waren und wie sehr man sich vor diesen Realitäten einfach gedrückt hat. Die Folge darauf, nach dem ganzen Chaos am Flughafen und all diesen Dingen, die wir erlebt haben, gesehen haben, natürlich vor allem für afghanischstämmige Menschen, Menschen, die jetzt zum Beispiel auch wie ich dort Freunde, Verwandte, Bekannte, Kolleginnen haben, war das nochmal extra belastend, also nicht nur beruflich, sondern auch privat. Und aber während das Ganze noch lief, hat sich eben eine neue Taliban-Regierung, ein neues Taliban-Regime vorgestellt. Und es war sehr beachtlich, meiner Meinung nach, dass man hier Männer gesehen hat, die Namen von Männern gesehen hat, die in den letzten 20 Jahren immer wieder für tot erklärt wurden. Zum Beispiel der bekannte Taliban-Führer Sirajuddin Haqqani, Militärchef der Taliban und jetzt Innenminister des neuen Taliban-Regimes, sein Onkel Khalilur Rahman Haqqani, mittlerweile Minister für das Geflüchtetenwesen. Und ähnlich verhielt es sich mit einigen anderen Männern. Warum ist es wichtig, das nochmal zu betonen? Weil einfach in den letzten 20 Jahren diese Männer regelmäßig für tot erklärt wurden, bis sie wieder lebendig auftauchten. Und jetzt haben wir sie nicht nur lebendig, sondern eben wieder auch an der Macht. Und niemand stellt sehr wenige Menschen stellen in diesem Kontext eine sehr berechtigte Frage. Und zwar, wer waren eigentlich all die Menschen, die an der Stelle dieser Männer getötet wurden, etwa durch vermeintlich präzise Drohnenansätze, durch Angriffe von amerikanischen Spezialtruppen und all diese Dinge. Und ich denke, es ist auch sehr bezeichnend, also dieser Umstand an sich ist schon sehr bezeichnend und macht auch nochmal im Gesamten das komplette Versagen des War on Terror in Afghanistan deutlich, der ja damals am 7. Oktober mit dem allerersten Drohnenangriff der Menschheitsgeschichte auf Mullah Omar, den damaligen Taliban-Führer, begann. Und wie wir wissen, starb auch Mullah Omar nicht an solch einer Operation, sondern erst über ein Jahrzehnt später eines natürlichen Todes. Aber um jetzt auch auf diese Regierung zu kommen oder auf dieses neue Taliban-Regime zu kommen und was da nach den ersten 100 Tagen dessen Amtszeit deutlich wird, ist Folgendes. Und zwar, was die Taliban sehr deutlich gemacht haben, als sie ihr neues Regime verkündet haben, war die Tatsache, dass sie sich in vielerlei Hinsicht nicht geändert haben, dass sie wenig dazu in der Lage sind oder nicht wirklich die Haltung vertreten, gewisse Kompromisse einzugehen, weil auf der einen Seite vor allem dieser Haqqani-Flügel sehr dominant war und auf der anderen Seite die Elite oder die ehemalige Riege von Mullah Muhammad Omar, also auch der jetzige Taliban-Führer Mullah Hassan Akhund gehört zu dem engsten Vertrauten von Mullah Omar. Er war jener Mann, der ihm den Umhang des Propheten Mohammed also damals überreicht hat. Da gibt es ja eins der wenigen Bilder von Mullah Omar und wie er eben diesen Umhang um sich schwingt. Und der Mann, der ihm den Umhang gegeben hat, das war der jetzige Taliban-Chef, der jetzige Staatsführer des wiederbelebten afghanischen Emirats. Und die Taliban haben jetzt vor allem ein großes Problem, in der Hinsicht, dass sie von einer Guerilla-Gruppierung, schrägstrich terroristische Gruppierung, wie man das auch immer jetzt nennen mag, aber auf jeden Fall von einer Bewegung, die vor allem in den letzten 20 Jahren im Guerillakrieg tätig war, nun die Staatsführung übernommen hat. Und in den letzten 20 Jahren und auch in den Einflussgebieten der Taliban in den letzten 20 Jahren war es oft so, dass die Taliban natürlich die Lücken des Kabuler Regimes von Hamid Karzai oder von Ashraf Ghani ausfüllen konnten, ausschlachten konnten, vor allem in Sachen Korruption. Ich habe Ihnen vor allem vorhin ein Beispiel genannt aus dem Distrikt Musai. Ich weiß noch, wie damals die Menschen gesagt haben, hier, da ist das Gebäude des Taliban-Richters und ein paar Meter weiter ist das Gebäude des Richters der Kabuler Regierung. Wir gehen alle zum Taliban-Richter, der ist nicht korrupt, der erfüllt unsere Belange sehr schneller und effektiver, der drangsaliert uns nicht und das macht das alles einfacher. Die Taliban konnten in den letzten 20 Jahren erfolgreich diese Lücken und vor allem diese Korruption, die sich auf Seiten der Kabuler Regierung wirklich in allen Bereichen durchzog, in allen Bereichen, die Sie sich vorstellen können, war Korruption da und hat eigentlich das ganze Ding von unten zerstört. Und ich sehe hier auch einige Fragen, zum Beispiel, auf die kann ich kurz eingehen, vor allem, weil das jetzt das afghanische Militär betrifft. Das afghanische Militär ist auch zerfallen, weil viele Militäroffizielle korrupt waren und quasi ihre eigenen Soldaten im Stich gelassen haben, Deals mit den Taliban abgesprochen hatten oder einfach viele der Soldaten in den letzten Monaten und Jahren nicht auszahlten, nicht gut behandelten. So dass viele dieser Männer, ich war im Frühjahr 2021 noch an der Front bei afghanischen Soldaten in der Provinz Konar und jeder, der den Alltag dieser Männer gesehen hat, hat zwei Dinge gemerkt. Erstens, sie kämpfen trotzdem, sie kämpfen immer noch. Also es ist nicht so, dass diese Männer einfach aufgegeben haben und geflüchtet sind, aber es ist absehbar, dass die Gräben zwischen diesen einfachen Soldaten und den politischen Eliten in Kabul einfach so tief sind, dass das irgendwann kippen wird. Und auf jeden Fall, um wieder auf die eigentliche Thematik zurückzukommen, die Taliban konnten all diese Dinge gut für sich instrumentalisieren und ausstatten, aber jetzt sind ja diese ganzen Akteure weg. Diese Akteure gibt es nicht mehr. Es gibt nur noch das Taliban-Regime. Es gibt keine anderen Akteure, auf die die Taliban mit den Fingern zeigen können. Sie haben jetzt die volle Verantwortung. Hier ist irgendein störendes Geräusch jetzt bei mir. Hören Sie das auch? Das ist leider etwas unangenehm.
Ein leichtes Rauschen, aber
Ja.
wir können Sie gut verstehen.
Okay, jetzt ist es weg. Alles klar. Genau, diese Akteure sind alle weggefallen und die Taliban haben jetzt die volle Verantwortung. Ich denke, dass sie in vielerlei Hinsicht dieser Verantwortung nicht gerecht werden können. Natürlich sind 100 Tage jetzt nicht viel, aber sie haben mit sehr vielen Problemen auch in den eigenen Reihen zu kämpfen. Diese Probleme geraten allerdings einigermaßen in den Hintergrund, weil leider auch in den letzten Wochen und Monaten die Afghanistan-Berichterstattung auch in den sozialen Medien und so weiter sehr stark von Fake News und etc. dominiert wurde, so dass manche etwa den Eindruck hatten, die Taliban würden kurz vor dem Zerfall stehen und der Haqqani-Flügel hat vielleicht den Flügel von Mullah Baradar, der die Gespräche in Katar geleitet hat, angegriffen. Da gab es sogar falsche Berichte von Tötungen etc. Das ist nicht der Fall. Diese Fehlanalyse hat uns auch zu dem heutigen Tag geführt, weil wir das in den letzten 20 Jahren immer wieder gehört haben, weil es einfach sehr viele Beobachter gab, die diese Gruppierung falsch eingeschätzt haben und diese Differenzen, die es zwischen denen gab, komplett aufgebauscht haben oder wirklich daraus ein komplett anderes Szenario geschaffen haben, was eigentlich so nie existiert hat. Deshalb muss man an dieser Stelle nochmal sagen, die Taliban sind in vielerlei Hinsicht eine geeinte Gruppierung mit einer Struktur. Sie waren in vielerlei Hinsicht geeinter als andere politische Akteure in Afghanistan. Das beste Beispiel hierfür sind die Präsidentschaftswahlen 2019 bzw. 2020, als es wieder dieses Szenario zwischen Abdullah und Ghani gab und beide sich gleichzeitig zum Präsidenten küren ließen. Da wurde von den Taliban leider zu Recht im Kontext der Gespräche gesagt, naja, was wollt ihr von uns, mit denen sollen wir hier verhandeln? wir sind doch geeint, aber die politische Führung in Kabul, die ist das ja selber nicht. Und ja, auch das hat zum heutigen Tag geführt, aber die Taliban haben jetzt natürlich mit vielen Kämpfern zu tun, die nur mit dem Krieg aufgewachsen sind, die in den letzten 2 Jahrzehnten nur gekämpft haben und auch nichts anderes kennen. Und diese Menschen in den Alltag zu integrieren, vor allem in den Alltag in Städten zu integrieren, in denen sie noch nie waren, das ist eine Aufgabe, die ja sehr monumental ist und extrem schwierig ist. Eines der Resultate davon ist, dass es mittlerweile auch sogenannte Rogue Elements gibt unter den Taliban, die eigenständig handeln und unter anderem zum Beispiel wie vor kurzem ein Bericht von Human Rights Watch. Es gibt diese jungen Kämpfer, die mittlerweile zu Rogue Elementen auch zum Teil geworden sind, die Racheaktionen durchführen in ihren Dörfern, in ihren Provinzen, die trotz Amnestieversprechungen der Führung mittlerweile Soldaten getötet haben, Ex-Soldaten, Ex-Polizisten, Dolmetscher jagen etc. Das ist natürlich etwas. Vorhin hat Herr Bin Shah etwas Wichtiges gesagt. Er meinte, Kabul sei nicht Afghanistan. Und ich bitte Sie, dies auch jetzt zur Kenntnis zu nehmen. Das ist etwas Wichtiges, auf das ich auch immer wieder mich fokussiert habe. Kabul ist nicht Afghanistan, aber wenn Sie jetzt das Taliban-Regime sehen und wie es sich aufführt, auch jetzt sollte man nicht nur auf Kabul fokussiert sein, weil natürlich wissen die Taliban, dass es internationale Beobachter gibt, dass in der Hauptstadt viele Journalisten sind, die das Geschehen beobachten. Und umso softer zeigen sie sich dort, weil auch unter ihnen gewisse Pragmatiker natürlich mehr oder weniger das Sagen haben, zum Teil und versuchen, ihrem Fußvolk zu erklären, so in der afghanischen Hauptstadt, in dieser urbanen Gegend, da können wir uns nicht so aufführen wie in irgendwelchen Dörfern oder so, die wir schon länger kontrollieren. Und viele leiten daraus dann vielleicht einen falschen Schluss und denken, ja, die Taliban haben sich hier großartig verändert und sind jetzt etwas komplett anderes. Ich denke nicht, dass das ideologisch jetzt so der Fall ist und weil eben vor allem, wie der besagte Bericht auch sehr gut deutlich gemacht hat von Human Rights Watch, es eben schon zu gezielten Tötungen gekommen ist. Es gibt trotz Amnestieversprechungen etc. gibt es Menschen, die sich weiterhin verstecken, die Angst haben. Ich stehe mit verschiedenen Menschen in Kontakt, die jetzt wirklich jetzt nichts aufbauschen oder irgendwie irgendwas lügen oder so, um hierher zu kommen. Das gibt's ja leider auch immer wieder und ich weiß, dass das in der innerafghanischen Debatte dann immer wieder präsent ist, dass da manche sagen, ja, aber die wollen ja nur hierher kommen und erfinden irgendwas oder so. Das ist mitnichten so. Es gibt Menschen, die tatsächlich bedroht sind und sie sich verstecken und ja, die auch jetzt in diesem Moment gefährdet sind. Und gleichzeitig sind die Taliban hier ja natürlich absolut in der Verantwortung. Und des Weiteren ist eine andere interessante Entwicklung zu beobachten. Bevor ich zum Schluss komme, ist mir das nochmal wichtig, weil ich habe in den letzten 20 Jahren, ich habe in den letzten 10 Jahren, sage ich mal, vor allem über den War on Terror in Afghanistan berichtet und eine These, die ich gerade so verfolge, ist, dass die Taliban jetzt so ihren War on Terror durchsetzen. Und zwar gibt es ein Element, was jetzt die Taliban so heimsucht, wie sie es einst im Fall der afghanischen Regierung gemacht haben, und zwar die afghanische IS-Zelle, die weiterhin totale Anschläge begeht, die in den letzten Wochen und Monaten Moscheen, Minderheiten etc. angegriffen hat. Und da haben die Taliban, die sich sehr oft selbst immer damit preisen, dass sie für Sicherheit sorgen könnten, absolut versagt, weil der IS hier ja sehr frei agieren kann. Und ich habe das auch aus gewissen Kreisen mitbekommen, dass die Taliban die IS-Gefahr herunterspielen, während sie gleichzeitig wissen, dass sie in mehreren Provinzen als zuvor, als auch in den Monaten und Jahren zuvor da ist und sie aktiv bedroht. Und gleichzeitig, ja, da habe ich tatsächlich eine Geschichte aus meiner Kabuler Nachbarschaft, im Bericht im Stadtteil Dalaman. Da war es nämlich so, dass in dem Haus neben uns, also das Haus des Nachbars, stand länger leer. Wir wussten da auch nicht, was da los ist. Vor ein paar Wochen gab es eine Taliban-Operation. Das ganze Haus wurde ja ziemlich heftig in Schutt und Asche gelegt. Es wurden mehrere Menschen verhaftet, die sich dort aufhielten und auch getötet und verletzt. Und offiziell hieß es, das war ein IS-Versteck. Jetzt wissen wir aber überhaupt nicht, ob das so stimmt. Es gibt auch niemanden, der das überprüfen kann. Und dieser Vorwand des IS, also die Gefahr des IS ist da, aber für die Taliban ist das natürlich auch ein guter Vorwand, um gegen jegliche Art von Opposition irgendwie vorzugehen, und zwar sehr brutal vorzugehen. Und genau dasselbe wurde eigentlich in den letzten 20 Jahren auch von der afghanischen Regierung und auch von den Amerikanern und ihren Verbündeten gemacht im Zuge des War on Terrors und hat dazu geführt, dass es oftmals die Falschen traf und sich dann auch gewisse Massen radikalisiert haben. Und genau das könnte sich nun wiederholen. Und ja, natürlich, ich wollte jetzt noch ein bisschen über die wirtschaftliche Situation reden. Die Zeit erlaubt es vielleicht nicht so, aber es wurde auch vorhin angeschnitten, Afghanistan befindet sich in einer humanitären Katastrophe. Es ist so, dass viele Menschen bereits hungern und man hat ja einen Staat in den letzten 20 Jahren geschaffen, der absolut in keinerlei Hinsicht wirtschaftlich unabhängig agieren kann. Und ich denke, es ist falsch, diesen Staat sich jetzt nun selbst zu überlassen, nur weil jene an der Macht sind, die man nicht an der Macht haben wollte. Vor allem sollte man sich auch die Frage stellen, ob man die Taliban tatsächlich nicht zurück an die Macht haben wollte, weil ja das einschneidende Erlebnis oder die einschneidende Handlung, die zu diesen ganzen Sachen jetzt geführt hat, waren natürlich auch die Taliban-Gespräche, die Abzugsgespräche mit den Taliban zwischen den Amerikanern und der politischen Delegation der Taliban in Katar. Und das hat den Taliban natürlich einen enormen Boost verschafft und sie in vielerlei Hinsicht nochmal legitimiert. Die Trump-Administration hat da auch sehr viel Appeasement gemacht. Also die Taliban haben zum Beispiel gesagt, wir reden nur mit euch, mit den Puppenmeister und nicht mit der Marionette in Kabul. Und anstatt da ein bisschen Rückgrat zu zeigen und sagen, nun ja, das sind jetzt aber nicht nur irgendwelche Marionetten, sondern da gibt's nochmal die afghanische Zivilgesellschaft, andere afghanische politische Akteure in Afghanistan. Wir müssen mit denen allen sitzen und ordentlich reden. Hat man gesagt, okay, passt, dann machen wir das halt so, wie ihr es wollt. Und ja, auch das hat zur jetzigen Situation geführt. Und ich denke, um zum Abschluss zu kommen, es kann nicht sein, dass man jetzt 30 Millionen Afghanen im Kollektiv bestraft und vor allem während eines kalten Winters, der ja immer noch vor der Tür steht. Und deshalb hoffe ich sehr, dass die internationale Staatengemeinschaft ja, Afghanistan in dem Kontext nicht vergisst. Vielen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, lieber Herr Feroz. Es gibt eine ganze Reihe von Fragen im Chat. Die bekommen natürlich nicht alle mit. Insofern darf ich Sie, die Sie Fragen haben, bitten, diese dann auch gleich per Handzeichen, so wie eingangs gesagt. Sie finden ja die Möglichkeit, unten in Ihrer Menüleiste unter Reaktionen per Handzeichen aufzuzeigen. Nach dem Beitrag von Michael Sample werden wir sofort in die Diskussion und in die Fragerunde öffnen. Bevor wir jetzt aber zu Michael Sample kommen, eine letzte abschließende Frage von mir, lieber Herr Feroz. Was raten Sie den Internationalen? Was raten Sie auch der deutschen Politik?
Ja, also ich war
auch über die Zukunft, nicht nur über humanitäre Dinge, sondern auch über die politische Zukunft Afghanistans verhandeln?
Ja, Sie waren kurz weg, aber ich glaube, ich habe es verstanden. Ich weiß, wie schwierig es ist, diesen Spagat zu machen. Ich unterscheide nochmal zwischen humanitärer Hilfe, die dringend notwendig ist, und Entwicklungshilfe. Der Punkt ist allerdings dass es leider auch so ist, meiner Meinung nach, dass der Westen, der sogenannte Westen, in vielerlei Hinsicht seine moralische Deutungshoheit verspielt hat und da nicht drum herumkommen wird, um mit den Taliban Kontakte aufrechtzuerhalten und mit ihnen zu verhandeln. Ich denke, alles andere wäre tatsächlich sehr kontraproduktiv. Da hat man schon viele Möglichkeiten verpasst und man hätte das natürlich anders gestalten können, so dass das nicht so weit gekommen wäre. Aber nun haben wir den Salat und ja, deshalb wird es schwierig, sich da komplett, also dieser Spagat, irgendwie Gelder zu zahlen an den Taliban vorbei und so weiter, der ist sehr, sehr schwierig. Also ich habe da auch keine endgültige Antwort drauf, aber er ist sehr schwierig und ich denke, also mit dieser Realität muss man sich jetzt auch befassen. Ansonsten wird man wieder von einer anderen Realität eingeholt, so wie Ende Mitte August das der Fall war. Und ich habe ein paar der Fragen gesehen, ich würde dann gerne später darauf zurückkommen.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank für den Moment. Wir können ganz sicherlich nicht heute Abend und auch nicht im Laufe der gesamten Tagung alle diese schwierigen Fragen auch nicht zu diesem Zeitpunkt jetzt, Anfang Dezember, 3 Monate nach dieser Machtübernahme und auch mit der Vorgeschichte, die ja jetzt mehrfach erwähnt worden ist, hier lösen und die Fragen abschließend beantworten. Ich möchte gerne überleiten zu Michael Sample. Und zwar, Michael Sample hat unsere Tagung schon mehrmals mit seiner Expertise und auch langjährigen Afghanistan-Erfahrung bereichert. Er hat neben seiner akademischen Arbeit unter anderem für die UN, aber auch als stellvertretender EU-Repräsentant in Afghanistan und vor allem mit und über die Taliban gearbeitet. Mehr als 25 Jahre hat er in Afghanistan und Pakistan gelebt. Lieber Michael Sample, was ist aus Ihrer Sicht die richtige Strategie mit Blick von außen auf die zukünftigen Kontakte und Beziehungen zu dieser Taliban-Regierung?
So,
Go ahead.
and sorry, I will speak in English. Sorry to inflict English upon you, but here we are. And thanks for having me back. I wanted to start just by remembering all the Afghans who've died in the events of the past 3-4 months, and those who've had their lives turned upside down. I mean, I think so many of us know people whose whole hopes have been shattered by the way that events have happened. I, perhaps like so many here, hoped and worked for a better outcome. I hoped that we would see sustainable peace in Afghanistan. I'm bitterly disappointed that we do not see it. But my ongoing research tells me that there's still much more change will happen in Afghanistan, and perhaps there are still opportunities to work and to hope to get back onto a path of sustainable peace. Nobody should accept that this is the end of the story in Afghanistan. What I want to talk about is an initial assessment of how the Taliban are doing, how they've performed since they took over on the 15th of August. I think it's important. First of all, it's important for Afghans because one way of looking at it is that the Taliban are holding 35 million hostages. Often when they talk with international interlocutors, that's pretty much the spirit in which they're talking. They have complete control of the Afghan state. That means for now, at least, the Taliban's performance determines the fate of the Afghan population, and they're subject to no accountability. It's also, I think, important for us to evaluate the Taliban now and as we go forward because of its implications for future of international action to help crisis-affected countries. I mean, just literally just less than an hour ago, I was talking with a senior Western policymaker who was talking about the implications of this for future ability to help in Yemen, in Ethiopia, things that remain to be done in Syria. The restored Taliban rule after 20 years of global cooperation on the country, this will be the reference point for anybody considering mobilizing to support a crisis-affected country. I think few people want to suffer a fate like the Afghans have suffered over the past 4 months. It's important to know actually what has happened. But also I think we know that how the Taliban perform has spillover effects onto other countries in the region and globally: mass migration, narcotics, criminal networks, inspiration of militant Islamist movements. This how the Taliban perform really matters. And of course, I don't think a definitive evaluation can be done now. We're talking about some provisional observations. When we're looking at how the Taliban are performed, of course, it starts with the transition. So the final moments as they came into power, the days afterwards. Perhaps if we try to make sense of it, we shouldn't look at the events around August 15th, 2021 in isolation. After all, in Afghanistan, we've had multiple transitions. I've seen a few myself, but if you just You could go back to the 19th century, but if you look back to the Daud coup in 1973, you can compare with that, the Taraki coup in 1978, Karmal coup in 1979, Mujahideen victory in 1992, the first Taliban takeover in 1996, Taliban collapse in 2001, a sort of a wave of revolutions in the country. Internationally, of course, the comparison people look at is Saigon in 1975. Making sense of what's happened, it's good to have has these comparisons in the background. What happened, we saw, was there was an internationally backed plan in place until the end. Some people really believed it until, literally until the time that Ashraf Ghani jumped on the plane. People believed that there was going to be a managed transition, but in the end, facts on the ground, because of actions of particular actors, both the Taliban and the government, these facts on the ground move quicker than diplomacy could keep up with. And so those diplomatic efforts delivered nothing. I think a lot of us will look back to 1992, where sort of a similar story played out. The rapidity of the collapse, so this, the sense that, one day, 1 hour, the government is there, and then the next it isn't, and the lack of widespread fighting in the, in the final stages once the fate of the government seems to be settled. If you actually look through the list of revolutions that I mentioned in Afghanistan, that actually turns out to be the dominant pattern in Afghanistan. Of course, we remember there was fighting in 1992, but it sort of wasn't around the collapse of the government. It was in the power struggle, which took off after that. It wasn't a rearguard action fought by the government. It was fighting between the multiple rival claimants to power in 1992. And also there's something which we could easily forget, but should follow, the fact that the whole country switched together once the capital changed. It didn't happen in 1996 when the Taliban took over Kabul, but it has been a characteristic of most Afghan transitions. It's the way that regime change happens in Afghanistan. I think one of the aspects of this collapse, the exodus, this is something which has happened in a very particular way in this crisis. Of course, we know about the previous refugee movements which have happened during the war rather than during the regime change. I think we can say that no Afghan transition has happened like this. The way that people fled the change of government rather than fleeing the fighting. And for a comparator, one has to look outside Afghanistan. That's where you look at Saigon rather than looking at previous transitions in Kabul. And I think a more subtle one to be looking to try and understand what's happened here. So we have to look at the tensions between continuity versus collapse of the state as you get this state capture. The pattern that I see in the previous Afghan transitions from 1973 onwards is that the revolutionary victor tries to demonstrate victory by capturing the state and showing that they have it there intact. They're occupying all the ministry buildings, all the provincial centers, and that the initial impulse is to capture and hold the state, not to transform it. But as you go forward, there's a tension between the revolutionary state building, changing things, but building that state in their own image, the kind of thing which Daud certainly tried to do, Taraki perhaps wanted to do, but then pushing in the other direction is the actual inability to maintain the state, that the revolutionary forces cannot maintain continuity, and that destroys the state from within. I think that tension is still playing out inside Afghanistan. So I'd like to to come into the specifics of how the Taliban have done. To be logical, I'd like to look at performance, which is what the Taliban have done and how that compares with what they talked about or what they promised, and then separately a little bit of outcomes, which are not about specifically on Taliban actions. It's really what the end result is. So 7 factors in which I think we can compare Taliban performance since the 15th of August with what they promised beforehand. The first one was the issue of inclusive government. In the extended dialogue and the negotiations that went on before this all happened, multiple times the Taliban stated that they were committed to inclusive government, they and their apologists have continued to talk about, and some even still talk about it. And of course, there have been disputes over what the meaning of inclusive is. Does it just mean ethnic labels that that you can tick the boxes that there are some people from all Afghan ethnic groups in the national administration, or does it mean something more that that all parts of Afghan society really feel that they are included in the power structures of government? Pretty much on any criterion, any meaningful sense of inclusive government, the Taliban have done the opposite of what they promised. They've, firstly, in the sense that they've created administration completed exclusively at all levels of power, that the provinces and the center of essentially card-carrying Taliban, basically clerics and commanders judged loyal to the movement, and people looking at this administration from out say, basically, if you're not a pro-Taliban cleric, you have no place in this new administration. Incredibly exclusive, but of course it's exclusive in gender terms as well. They never made a specific promise to bring women into government, but they certainly talked about having been reformed and not wanting to restrict women's role in public life. Women have been excluded, and also in terms of ethnic patterns. Now the power balance inside the administration has shifted decisively to Pashtun Taliban. That's not quite the same as Pashtuns, but it's clear that all ethnic groups other than the Pashtuns feel completely excluded from this. And of course, a majority of Pashtuns probably feel excluded, but not on ethnic grounds, via virtue of not being Taliban. Secondly, I think we can say that before August 15th, there was a Taliban promise of moderation. We're very familiar with the statements they gave saying that we are not the same Taliban that ruled in the 1990s. We've listened to world and international norms. We've watched our own population has changed. We've learned from mistakes that we made during our period of extremism in the 1990s. They talked about this. And I would say that in broad terms, I think I can say that there is no evidence that they really have moderated. But I think we can also say that the final shape of Taliban rule in Afghanistan isn't yet clear. They have announced numerous restrictions, like on women's roles, like in the media. They've patchily enforced them. And it seems that, so I would say that their approach to culture is a work in progress. But when we look at the kind of the way that much of the media has disappeared, and that there have been strong warnings put out to members of the media, I think that's an example of how freedom of expression is massively reduced. And I think that the claims that the super moderate Taliban promised by the political commission during the 2-3 years of dialogue, this has not been delivered. So thirdly, on performance versus promises, the issue of amnesty. Now, amnesty is vitally important. The issue of amnesty, reconciliation, as you try to end the conflict, as you go from as you go through the process of regime change. And the Taliban announced a general amnesty for Republican forces, but this has not been implemented. I think there was reference in the previous speaker to the Human Rights Watch report. The team in Human Rights Watch thoroughly investigated how this announced amnesty has worked, and it becomes clear that the Taliban have systematically pursued a selective strategy, selective campaign of arrests and executions directed in particular to members of the former regime security forces, and then there's a list of other categories that they have targeted. Some bits of civil society, people who were understood to have collaborated with these security forces, people who spoke out against the Taliban, and although when they sit with international interlocutors, of course, the Taliban blame this on rogue elements inside their movement. But I think the documentation of Human Rights Watch and certainly reporting that I'm doing suggests no, it's systematic. It's done with lists. It's an organized way. There is no amnesty. On the political system, also the Taliban promised before their takeover that they would not insist upon a political monopoly. I heard many Western diplomats explaining to me that the Taliban have moved away from their aspiration to impose an Islamic emirate. I told them, long before August 15th, that my research indicated that the Taliban were fully committed to re-establishing their emirate. That is indeed what they have done, although they're left with a really quite a strange situation around their emir, Mullah Haibatullah, who's supposed to be in charge. They haven't really managed to convince anybody that he's playing any meaningful role. And of course, they're still, despite his reported appearance to go and to talk to some madrasa students and say make a rather meaningless prayer, still many senior Taliban don't even really think he's alive, but he certainly has no clear and visible role as a head of state or even head of movement. The fifth promise, which I think the Taliban made and should be held accountable towards, is their promise to settle differences once the foreign forces left. This was very much part of the way in which they wooed the Americans to the idea of the Americans leaving and things will be okay. Was the Taliban refrain that we only have to keep on fighting while the foreigners are here. As soon as the foreign forces leave, Afghans will settle their differences peacefully. And yet, on the very day that the last US troop left, the Taliban launched a major military offensive against Panjshir and Andarab. And although large-scale fighting is not underway at the moment, small-scale fighting certainly is, and the Taliban at no stage since August 15th have demobilized, and they absolutely have not shown any indication to pursue negotiation rather than military force. And because they expect armed, they are telling their military to be ready for further action. The idea of Taliban leading the way in settling differences peacefully has turned out to be a mirage. Another promise which they made in a sort of, I think we can say like an informal promise, it was like sort of a trademark, was promising clean government. That they portrayed the Republican government as being systematically corrupt, and they promised that when they were in power, they would bring an end to that corruption, clean government. Now, on one level, the Taliban have announced that their customs take is actually up compared to the Republican government, despite the reduction in the actual flow of trade. So that does indicate a significant reduction in diversion of customs revenues. That's one of the, and they certainly have been putting out the message that they will be able to pay some civil servant salaries on the basis of the money that they've collected there. And that's the first sign that the Taliban have been able to point to, saying that they're delivering on one of their promises. However, and I find some of that quite plausible. I've, as an analyst, previously noted that it was ironic that the Taliban seemed better at public finance than the Western-backed democratic government. However, that we can also see numerous forms of corruption being practiced inside the Taliban regime. Some slightly deniable. There's been this epidemic of extortion and grabbing of assets. I think we can say quite clearly that if there ever were clean Taliban, they're not. It doesn't tell the story now. The Taliban have seem in a hurry to raise money to reward themselves from the 20 years of effort. Then they have not delivered the clean government that they promised. And the seventh criterion that I'd like to raise, where they promised, was the issue of controlling terrorism, controlling foreign militants. Now, this, of course, we know is something which is very important in foreign policy. It's also more difficult to gauge, and I think that I would suggest that we say the jury should still be out on this one. Despite a few hiccups in the early days, they've avoided sort of conspicuous displays of foreign militants. That we don't have situation of that as we had pre 9/11 of foreign militant groups of renting houses in Kabul, where in those days we could actually go around and that this was actually happening, and instead the Taliban intelligence service has sort of like marshaled some of many of the foreign militants into new places in Afghanistan and told them to stay there. And in some places, the Taliban authorities have delivered ID cards, Afghan ID cards, to foreign militants, and even helped in allocating them land and houses, and told them then that they can be Afghans now. And it seems that this is probably something which was negotiated with the US in Doha as a way of solving the US's or the international problem of militancy. My reading of this is that the Taliban are very carefully parking and holding in reserve the foreign terrorists, the foreign militants who have been operating in the country for the past 20 years, and it's tied to their attempts to get recognition. They can undo this, but I think also when the Western experts try to assess the Taliban's performance on counterterrorism commitments, I mean the elephant in the room is that. The real experts in militancy, the bomb makers, the suicide bomb trainers, the ideologues, they've all just been brought into the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, and the Intelligence Service, and they've been put in charge, and they retain both their national and their global networks, and nobody has indicated in any way that they have sort of reformed or given up on what they have practiced and believed in for the past however many decades. The elephant in the room is, maybe the Uyghurs are not going to attack China, but what's the impact of having suicide bombing trainers running security forces? Now, if those were 7 promises where I think that the Taliban have done poorly against, separately on outcomes, I think we can look through on things that have happened. On the issue of recognition, now the Taliban have not been recognized by either the regional or Western powers. That's actually an important outcome, that they this lack of recognition encourages Afghans to imagine that the Taliban will not be around for long, and au contraire, the Taliban are hoping to gain recognition so they can send a message to their supporters and to the population that they've been accepted and that they are going to be in control of Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. In outcomes, I think armed conflict is a very important outcome. There was a fear that there might be protracted conflict even after the Taliban moved into Kabul. There's been a welcome reduction in armed conflict so far with the disappearance of the old front lines. But certainly my research indicates that violence continues at a lower level, and there is significant prospect of it escalating as we go forward, and sort of discontent into the Taliban increases, and those who would resist them become more organized. As I hinted earlier, I think one of the most spectacular features of the outcome since the Taliban took over is the brain drain. We've seen the spectacle of 150,000 people being evacuated in the days immediately after the collapse. The exodus continues, and even the Taliban admit this. So it's in a strange situation where almost everybody wants to leave. The Taliban have failed to persuade Afghans, educated and professionals, the urban population, and even much of the rural population, that they have a future in the country. I mean, this is absolutely massive for Afghanistan, of the world, and as long as this continues, it undermines any prospect of sort of stabilizing Afghanistan. Economic crisis, everybody's talked about it. It's real, it's massive. It's partly an outcome of the way that Afghanistan was more vulnerable to collapse in 2021 than it was in 2001. There wasn't a modern economy in place when the Taliban were pushed out. There was a sort of a modern economy functioning with banks and telecommunications and sophisticated control systems up until the 15th of August. Without educated people, you can't run it. With sanctions in place, of course, it becomes even more difficult. So the Taliban opting to sabotage the attempts at a negotiated outcome and grabbing power have precipitated the economic crisis. Humanitarian crisis, fifth outcome, somewhat separate from the economic crisis, very real. It's a consequence of largely of the economic crisis. It comes on top of existing vulnerabilities. This too is massive. And I wanted to give one final outcome, which is, as a sort of a Taliban watcher like myself, I take this very seriously. Factionalization of the movement itself. Of course, the Taliban are trying to spread the notion that things are fine, they're in charge, just recognize us, give us the assets, everything will be okay. But what we see over the past 3 months is that the movement has become more factionalized than at any time in its history. Direct competition between the Haqqani network, backed by the ISI, who've grabbed the major spoils and are in secure control of many bits of the capital and the country. So there's a split between them and other parts of the movement, and this goes down even to the issue of control of police stations. A couple of hundred armed fighters turn up at a police station saying, "We're in charge now," arrest the incumbent police chief from the other faction and take over. This doesn't get so much coverage in the media, but it's absolutely critical for saying that we do not have a stable end state, it's not just other members of the population, non-Taliban, who feel excluded. Many members of the Taliban movement feel also that they've lost out in the power struggle. So just to start to wind up, the main achievement of the Taliban over the past 3.5 months is that they've successfully grabbed power. They've held it for over 100 days. They've got control of the state. They've inserted people into positions. They've taken over the patronage networks that previously the Republic used. And they're able to project an image for people who are prepared to believe it, that they are securely in control and will remain so. Beyond that, they have achieved little. Neither are they reformed to deliver the soft Taliban and a sort of Islamic welfare state, or get on the path towards to being recognized and in a sense doing the things that the Republic wasn't able to do. Nor have they even really delivered on the ideological project which they promised to their own supporters, delivering an Islamic system. All that we've seen over the past 3.5 years has basically been the power play inside the Taliban. Somebody's described in one of the provinces as lots of insignificant, local commanders squabbling amongst themselves for control of the spoils, losing sight of what they were supposed to do with the state once they've captured it. The very fact that they don't have a functional leader, you've got a rather ineffective person who's put in as a sort of like a neutral caretaker, Mullah Hassan as prime minister, and a silent notional head of state, means that nobody's really articulated what the Taliban are going to do in control of Afghanistan, other than saying we would like to be recognized. And as everybody responds to this, I think I would like to look at the importance of the international stance, and also the importance of Afghan agency, what Afghans do. We should not forget that the way in which the Europeans and the Americans deal with the Taliban has a really outsized impact on Afghan perceptions and actions. The fact that they haven't recognized the Taliban so far is influencing the decisions that Afghans make as to whether they should aspire to something better in their country, or whether they should abandon it and flee. And yet the tentative moves that we see from countries like Germany, UK, perhaps less so US, to get to engage with the Taliban and trying to come up with perhaps joint statements, things that they can do together. That runs the risk, actually, rather than making things better in Afghanistan, of actually getting a message to Afghans that do not dare to hope for anything better now. This is your fate. And finally, I would say that the Afghan agency is incredibly important, despite the political phenomenon that Afghanistan people tend to look and see, ask, what are the foreigners doing? Okay, and then sort of make their decision in terms of their stance after that. My understanding is that the Taliban have systematically failed or refused to include the bulk of the Afghan population in their administration, and they have offered no pathway towards that. I think that things will change. I don't think they're going to stay. They're going to stay this way. I don't think the Taliban are going to maintain a power monopoly in this way. Maybe things get worse. Maybe the armed conflict intensifies again. Perhaps there is a negotiated way to a more inclusive political system. Perhaps it's one which will involve another period of violence. Stances taken by Afghans will be critical in this, perhaps even more so than during the period of international intervention. Afghan agency, the decisions that Afghans make to dare to hope and strive for something better in their country or to quit their country, that will determine the outcome. So overall, if I had to, and putting on my professor hat, if I had to do some marking, I might give the Taliban 3 out of 10 for their performance over the past 3 or 4 months. But if I were to mark the international actors on their performance, it would be lower. I think we barely get 2 out of 10. Thank you, Yura. I hope that's what you wanted.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, lieber Michael Sample, vor allem auch für die Notenverteilung am Schluss. Damit können wir, glaube ich, jetzt alle sehr deutlich sehen, wie Sie die Erfolge und die Gunst gutieren wollen. Ich habe einige Fragen im Chat gesehen. Ich hatte auch schon mir einige Handzeichen notiert, und zwar schon im Anschluss an den Vortrag von Imran Feroz, Winfried Nachtwey, Herr Beheshti und hier während des Vortrags von Michael Sample, Christine Schweizer mit einer Frage. Also, zeigen Sie gerne auf. Weiterhin, wir versuchen, so gut es geht, Sie ins Bild und mit Ton zu versorgen, sodass wir Sie alle hören und sehen können. Und meine letzte Bitte ist, fassen Sie sich möglichst wirklich kurz, damit viele die Chance haben, sich an der Diskussion zu beteiligen. Und wenn eben möglich, eine konkrete Frage an eine hier anwesende Person, vielleicht auch nochmal an Herrn bin Shah. Es kann ja sein, dass von da aus seinem Beitrag auch noch einiges rückzufragen ist. Soweit. Winfried Nachtwey ist der Erste. Bitte sehr.
Bin ich so gut zu verstehen? Gut, Dankeschön. Herzlichen Dank also für die 3 Inputs. Und meine Frage geht zum bisherigen Krieg in Afghanistan. Dieser Krieg scheint ja weitgehend erloschen zu sein, zumindest kein alltäglicher Krieg mehr mit, wie das vorher gesagt wurde, Hunderten von Kriegsopfern pro Tag. Und ich könnte mir zumindest vorstellen, dass vor Ort das Anlass ist für eine erhebliche Erleichterung. Man geht aus dem Haus und muss nicht unbedingt befürchten oder sich fragen, komme ich am Abend wieder zurück oder meine Verwandten. So, und meine Frage ist, weil ja dieser Sachverhalt zumindest in großem Maße erloschener Krieg bei uns in den Medien praktisch keine Rolle spielt. Wie ist da die Empfindung der afghanischen Menschen? Wird das also eben doch als Erleichterung also eben wahrgenommen oder wird das schnell von den anderen Riesenalltagsproblemen verdrängt? Dankeschön.
Ging die Frage an jemand konkret oder an beide?
Ruhig an beide, da können, glaube ich, beide aus ihrer Perspektive was sagen.
Dann bitte, Herr Ferros, mögen Sie reagieren?
Ja, klar, gerne. Ich kann versuchen, darauf zu antworten. Naja, wenn man schaut, natürlich hat der Krieg zahlenmäßig abgenommen. Natürlich gibt es weniger Todesopfer als in den letzten Jahren oder Monaten. Wenn man sich das so quantitativ anschaut, ist das ersichtlich. Und es gibt ja allerdings einige Dinge, auf die man hinweisen muss. Wenn die Taliban zum Beispiel, wie sie es vor einigen Wochen gemacht haben, diese ganzen Betonmauern, die die Kabuler Straßen blockiert haben, die den Verkehr oft behindert haben und so, und die auch die politische Klasse vom Rest der Gesellschaft getrennt haben. Wenn sie diese abbauen und das zelebrieren und sagen, so, wir sorgen hier für Ordnung, weil hier herrscht kein Krieg mehr, da muss man allerdings auch fair genug sein, und das sind sie leider nicht, um zu sagen, naja, diese Dinge wurden hier aufgebaut, weil wir in der Stadt Bombenangriffe durchgeführt haben. Und das ist halt so ein Punkt. Also wir haben hier einen Gewinner, es gibt hier einen Akteur, der jetzt gewonnen hat, sagen wir mal, und halt eben die Kontrolle hat. Und der Krieg oder der Konflikt hat abgenommen. Es gibt deutlich weniger Todeszahlen. Natürlich, also ich spreche jeden Tag mit sehr vielen verschiedenen Afghanen. Und es ist unterschiedlich, mit wem man spricht. Natürlich gibt es genug Menschen, die sagen, okay, ich kann mich jetzt sicher im Freien bewegen. Es gibt auch übrigens viele westliche Journalisten, die jetzt auf einmal ganz stolz sind und sagen, wir können uns das erstmal frei im Land bewegen und so. Ja, aber man darf das natürlich nicht zu sehr in so eine Richtung bringen, um das Narrativ der Taliban zu dienen. Ich kenne auch genug Menschen, die trauen sich gar nicht mehr raus, weil sie einfach, entweder einfach Angst haben, weil sie aufgrund ihrer vorherigen Tätigkeit, halt zum Beispiel als Ortskraft oder so, oder als Ex-Soldat, als Polizist, dass die sich gar nicht raustrauen und immer einen Herzinfarkt fast bekommen, wenn jemand an der Tür klopft. Das gibt's halt auch. Aber klar, zahlenmäßig kann man sagen, die Todesanzahlen haben abgenommen, der Krieg in der Form hat abgenommen, auch in vielen Gebieten, die von Luftangriffen und so weiter heimgesucht wurden. Auch da atmen natürlich die Menschen in einer gewissen Art und Weise auf. Aber das heißt nicht, dass man das jetzt irgendwie zu sehr beschönigt, was da jetzt passiert, wenn Sie verstehen, worauf ich hinaus will.
Michael Semple, möchten Sie auch noch darauf antworten? Oder auch Herr bin Shah, wenn Sie uns noch zusehen und zuhören, wie Sie diese Situation unmittelbar aus Kabul einschätzen?
I think this is a very important question, and it's a very important contemplation as well, that the war is now over, and whether it's a blessing or it's just a big thick wall against the challenges that Afghans across the country are facing on a daily basis. I think the war against poverty is still on. I think the war against so many other things are still on, just because now that we have a more secure situation or environment, it's not a favor. Afghans deserve peace, and they deserve, an environment where they can thrive and they have access to education, health, economy, and so many other things. So just saying that the war is over and everything is resolved now, or this is just a beautiful story now, and there is no more challenge for prosperity and to getting to the real peace, would be very myopic. And so I think this should be seen, in a very fine line difference between, the war ended, but there's so many other challenges that we are still facing. It's a very fragile situation right now. In the next few weeks, I would say, or months, are very critical in deciding the political and economic future of Afghanistan.
Ja, vielen Dank auch für diese wichtigen Hinweise und die Rückmeldung. Wir gehen dann weiter zu Gulrahim Safi.
Ja, schönen guten Abend. Ich bin Rahim Safi, ehrenamtlicher Vorsitzender des Afghanistan-Komitee für Frieden in Berlin. Vielen Dank für die Organisation dieser wichtigen Veranstaltung heute. An die Herr Trittmann und meinen ganz herzlichen Dank an Herr Mujadidi, Herr Feroz und auch Herr Binschai. Die haben sehr realistische Bericht über die aktuelle Lage in Afghanistan gegeben. Meine kurze Bemerkung: Wir müssen optimistisch sein und realistisch sein. Ja, Afghanistan hat positive Sachen jetzt und negativ. Positiv, die unsere Kollegen haben auch gesagt, wir haben keinen Krieg mehr und die Taliban sind eine realistische Gruppe. Jetzt ist meine Frage zuerst an Herr Feroz. Warum die Weltgemeinschaft hat Problem mit dem Namen Islamische Emirat Afghanistan, obwohl im Abkommen in Doha, die haben am 29. Februar mit den Amerikanern ein Abkommen abgeschlossen, dass eine neue islamische Regierung kommen. Das ist richtig. Das ist Frage an Herrn Feroz. Und zweite Frage an Wirtschaftsperson Herr Shah. Das ist, jetzt hat die Weltgemeinschaft 9,5 Milliarden Dollar von Afghanen gefrieren lassen. Hören Sie mich?
Ja.
Okay. Diese 9 von der Seite Afghanistan, Herr Shah ist ein wirtschaftlicher Person im Ökonomikbereich. Ist das richtig, dass die Weltgemeinschaft diese 9,5 Milliarden Geld von Afghanen in diese schwierige Situation gefroren lassen? Ob das ist nicht sinnvoll, dass diese Geld jetzt freilassen? Das ist die zweite Frage. Und das Gesamt an Sie eine Frage. Also die Beziehung zwischen Deutschland und Afghanistan. Ist Deutschland in der Lage, Afghanistan mehr behilflich sein in diese schwierige Situation? Wie Herr Mujadidi gesagt hat am Anfang, wir haben mehr als 100 Jahre Geschichte und Deutschland hat einen sehr guten Ruf in Afghanistan. Und wir dürfen nicht Afghaninnen und Afghanen in diese schwierige Situation allein und im Stich lassen. Vielen Dank. 3 Fragen hatte ich. Ja, Dankeschön.
Herzlichen Dank. Herr Feroz, Sie sind gleich schon in die Bresche gesprungen. Dann bitte.
Ja, also meine Antwort wird kurz ausfallen. Vielen Dank, Dr. Tasvik, für Ihre Frage. Aber ja, ich weiß gar nicht jetzt, ob die Weltgemeinschaft, also erstens, ich kann leider nicht für diese Weltgemeinschaft sprechen, aber ich weiß auch gar nicht, ob es so ein großes Problem jetzt nur mit dem Namen gibt. Ich habe auch bemerkt, dass innerhalb vieler afghanischen Communities, sage ich mal, es viele Debatten gab zwischen Islamisches Emirat versus Islamische Republik. Also da gab es auch viele Vorbehalte und ich bezweifle, dass es nur am Namen liegt. Ich denke, dass generell vor allem westliche Akteure einfach gewisse Vorbehalte haben, sobald sogenannte islamistisch-militante Akteure irgendwie an die Macht kommen. Und das ist halt in dem Fall so, weshalb auch viel Unwissenheit natürlich reproduziert wurde. Mir ist es in den letzten Wochen und Monaten allein anhand von Interviews aufgefallen, wenn mich dann zum Beispiel jemand gefragt hat, ja, Herr Feroz, jetzt kommt die Scharia zurück nach Afghanistan. Was denken Sie darüber? Dann weiß man gar nicht, was man auf so einen Schwachsinn antworten soll, das ist halt einfach, man weiß nicht mal, wo man anfangen soll. Es hieß ja auch zuvor Islamische Republik. Und man kann sich auch nicht so viel Zeit nehmen, jedem Zweiten dann zu erklären, was eigentlich Scharia bedeutet, dass das jetzt nicht irgendwie sogenannter Steinzeit-Islam ist. Und da gibt es sehr vieles, aber ich denke, man hat hier einfach Vorbehalte, wenn so ein Akteur generell wieder die Staatsführung übernimmt.
Vielen Dank, lieber Herr Feroz. Herr Shah, mögen Sie zu der Frage von Herrn Safi, was das Einfrieren der Gelder angeht, antworten? Hören Sie uns?
I think Dr. Safi asked a very important question, and this question is being asked almost every day, how the funds can be released, should be released or not, and the whole discussion around it and how helpful these funds would be. So just a reminder, on August 16, the IMF and the World Bank literally froze, all assets, loans, grants, everything that, belonged to Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. Now, because of the, nature of international arrangements that we have for a financial system to flow, or unfortunately at a halt because the condition of the transition and takeover in Kabul didn't happen is per the international community's agreement with the Taliban. And this twist in situation has now created a dilemma, literally, whether it's good to release those funds or not. And then, of course, the management of the funds and how the funds are going to be spent. My simple take on this would be that the funds belong to the people of Afghanistan. And these funds do not belong to any particular group, organization, movement, or any individuals or group of individuals. It belongs to the entire country and entire people. I think the Doha Agreement and what happened after Doha Agreement has created a very, sort of speaking, effective framework to engage and negotiate. And this, just like Professor Semple earlier commented, need really a catalyzing effect, because if they're doing it score 3, just like he mentioned, and the international community is performing 2 out of 10, that simply means more work and more diplomacy rather than using hard measures, because it's winters in Afghanistan. The human catastrophe or the economic catastrophe is very, very obvious. We do not have to delve more on identifying challenges. It's literally happening right in front of our eyes. And so releasing the funds will not have an overnight effect on the economy of Afghanistan, but it will have a very strong psychological impact and effect on the general psyche in the country, general conditions in the country, and specifically on the private sector, because technically speaking, the funds cannot literally turn Afghanistan into just another paradise. But just the news and the news that the international community still wants to engage the people of Afghanistan and are coming up with creative mechanisms of financial disbursements, I think it is going to be the right step to do. And I would request everybody to think more on those lines. And I'm very happy to report that the UNICEF has already rolled out a program and a project, coming up with very creative mechanisms, sort of bypassing the current government, and working directly with beneficiaries in the private sector of Afghanistan. The second question, which was related to Germany and its relationship with Afghanistan, I think I would agree with Dr. Safi. They're historic, they're very strong, and Germany has always played a very unique role when it comes to the international cooperation between Afghanistan and Germany, and all other areas and sectors that Germany and Afghanistan collectively pursue in terms of the interests, in terms of the cooperation happening in exchanges in the past, recent past, remote past. And I think Germany can do a lot in this, and is doing, as I observe and as I monitor. But, just like Dr. Semple said, I would say again, the efforts currently done are not enough. Diplomatic processes and negotiations are time consuming, but economics really do not wait for politics and political decisions made in big capitals or in Doha specifically. People simply cannot wait just because political decisions are not made. And, I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, but that's how economic cycles are run in the modern world. And in the post-COVID arena, as we see, it gets very complicated on every passing day, every passing minute, because the repercussions of those decisions made on August 16 and afterwards by the international community has literally pushed the Afghan people to a parallel economic and humanitarian catastrophe. And I think we cannot ignore it. We cannot hide from it, and we simply have to deal with it. Thank you so much.
Vielen Dank, lieber Herr bin Shah. Wir müssen uns leider an dieser Stelle jetzt sehr kurzfristig von Emran Feroz verabschieden, da er einen anderen Termin unbedingt jetzt wahrnehmen muss. All diejenigen unter Ihnen, die gerne noch eine Frage an Emran Feroz stellen möchten, die bitte ich, leiten Sie mir die per E-Mail weiter, schreiben Sie diese per E-Mail. Ich leite sie dann an Emran Feroz weiter und ich bringe sie so in Kontakt und Herr Feroz hat dann sicher die Gelegenheit, darauf noch zu antworten. Vielen Dank, Ihnen alles Gute, lieber Herr Feroz, und bis auf ein nächstes Mal. Danke Ihnen.
Vielen Dank. Danke Ihnen, Herr Zittmann. Und natürlich, also ich wiederhole das nur, falls es weitere Fragen gibt, können Sie sich gerne an mich wenden und ich versuche dann auf alles so bald wie möglich einzugehen. Ihnen auch vielen Dank, Herr Mujadidi und Herr Safi und Herr Beheshti und alle. Also vielen Dank und auf bald.
Danke Ihnen. Florian Kühn ist der Nächste auf der Liste.
Dankeschön. Das ist eine Frage, die an alle geht. Die Möglichkeiten der Taliban betreffen, das Land zu kontrollieren oder zu regieren. Gibt es Anzeichen dafür, dass die Taliban in der Lage sind, systematisch zu erfassen, was im Land eigentlich passiert? Das ist natürlich für jede Regierung ein Problem, aber gerade eben könnte das für die Taliban noch ein bisschen schwieriger sein, dass also die Verbindung zwischen einer zentralen Steuerung und den verschiedenen Provinzen, was die Allokation von Geld und aber auch das sicherheitspolitische Vorgehen betrifft, sozusagen wissen, was da passiert und die entsprechenden Entscheidungen überhaupt treffen können. Danke.
Ja, ich würde diese Frage gerne direkt an Michael Sample weiterleiten. Wenn Sie noch etwas Zeit für uns haben, wäre das wirklich gut. Ich denke, es gibt noch die eine oder andere Frage auch unmittelbar an Sie. Also, können Sie kurz darauf antworten, weil Sie das in Ihrem Beitrag ja auch schon angesprochen haben. Michael Sample, können Sie mich hören?
What would you like me to say?
Ja. Können Sie antworten auf die Frage, die gerade gestellt wurde? Ich kann sie auch gerne nochmal wiederholen. Florian Kühn fragt danach, wie Sie die Möglichkeiten der Kontrollfunktion durch die Taliban-Regierung einschätzen, auch zwischen dem zentralistischen System und der vor Ort und in den Provinzen gegebenen Strukturen. Glauben Sie oder schätzen Sie das so ein, dass das wie für jede Regierung natürlich notwendig gelingen kann, sich einen Überblick zu verschaffen und Kontrolle sozusagen über die Staatsgeschäfte, nenne ich es mal, und die Administration zu erhalten?
Can you give me a two sentence? I think I've got some of the gist of that, but you give me a 2-sentence summary of that if you want me to respond.
I'll try in English. Is there any indication that the Taliban are managing their communications and establishing knowledge about the country so that they can effectively control even in the provinces?
The Taliban already has pretty good knowledge around the country, given that it's part of the beauty of the Taliban movement that they've always been both centralized and decentralized at the same time. the barrier to the Taliban exerting effective control is not through a lack of knowledge. It's essentially through the highly exclusive system which they operate, so that they are there by force in the provinces and the districts, and at present by virtue of the lack of any alternative. So that the question as to whether the Taliban hang on or not is not really about do they adapt and do they learn. It's a question of whether those who do not accept the Taliban's authority and feel essentially inimically opposed to them, do they start to mount an effective challenge, which we know that the front which has been established in with a headquarters in Tajikistan, operating in Panjshir and part of Baghlan, they have aspirations to expand certainly across the north. So the question is, are they able to pull that off? Because the Taliban control is indeed, it's restricted to relatively small numbers of people in each of the administrative centers. In a sense, a little bit like the way that the Afghan Republican government was in contested areas. So the Taliban already know the areas, but they lack the support which would guarantee them sort of being able to hold on to those, and they don't have the political structures which would allow them to co-opt the different the representatives and those who hold power in the local areas. And so far, people are dealing with them, but relatively small numbers of significant power brokers have actually come over to them. Most people are still waiting to see what happens.
Right, thank you.
Ich danke ganz herzlich. Und der nächste auf der Liste ist Hamid Beheshti. Ich bitte auch Sie und alle anderen, die folgen, um kurze, präzise Fragen. Das erleichtert uns allen das Miteinander. Danke. Herr Beheshti.
2 Fragen. Hören Sie mich?
Ja, wir können Sie hören.
Folgendes. Erstens hörte ich hier überhaupt nicht von der Pashtunisierung des Landes durch Taliban. Und das läuft wirklich im Land. Die Dari-Sprache ist verboten im Rundfunk und durch die Regierung. Das ist die Sprache, die über die Mehrheit der Bevölkerung spricht. Pashtunen sind etwa höchstens 40% der Bevölkerung. Das ist das eine Problem. Nicht nur Pashtunisierung durch die Sprache, sondern auch Pashtunen werden in anderen Gebieten übersiedelt. Die bringt man aus Pakistan und die Hazaras bzw. Tadschiken werden vertrieben und Pashtunen setzt man an ihre Stelle. Diese Themen werden überhaupt nicht jetzt hier angesprochen. Die zweite Sache ist die Frage nach diesem Vertrag zwischen der USA und Taliban. Ich weiß nicht, ob die Herrschaften, die hier sprechen, von dem Vertrag, von dem Inhalt des Vertrags wissen. Ich habe nirgendwo gesehen, dass man über diesen Vertrag etwas Definitives, etwas Klares gesagt hat. Das soll etwa 400 Seiten umfassen, aber davon weiß man sehr wenig. Wenn die Herrschaften das gelesen haben, wäre es gut, wenn sie etwas darüber sagen. Alles.
Vielen Dank, Herr Beheshti. Ich würde denken, dass auch hier Michael Sample gerade auch auf die letzte Frage antworten kann. Und die Frage, die Herr Beheshti mit der sogenannten Pashtunisierung der Umsiedlungsthematik Sprachthematik angesprochen hat. Vielleicht können Sie, Herr bin Shah, dazu ganz kurz etwas sagen und darauf reagieren. Zuerst bitte, wenn möglich, Michael Sample zu der Frage des Vertrages zwischen den USA und den Taliban. Ich nehme an, Herr Beheshti, Sie meinen den Vertrag vom 29. Februar 2020.
So ist es.
Okay.
Yeah. Look,
Wir hören Sie.
Yeah, look,
we can hear you.
I'm only getting the German version, which is why I'm slow to respond.
Oh.
So if you give me one sentence summary, I'll respond. I don't understand the question.
The question was about the content of the treaty between the US government and the Taliban from February 2020. If you know about it and if you can tell, because nobody seems to really know what's inside.
Thank you for the summary. The substantive parts of the treaty between the Taliban and the US are publicly known. You can get them on the internet. There are two secret annexes. The secret annexes are consistent with the publicly available text. The text, but they don't contradict it. So in a sense, they're not there's not something secretly lurking there. You can understand this treaty by simply Googling it and reading it. It committed the US to its withdrawal on the condition that the Taliban proceed with controlling the activities of foreign militants so that they do not threaten US security interests, essentially ensuring that there was no spillover from foreign militants in Afghanistan. And it committed the Taliban to talk about a ceasefire and to enter negotiations with the other Afghan forces. They, to my mind, the Taliban systematically violated the commitments which they gave in that agreement, but the US was determined to withdraw anyway and imposed no consequences on the Taliban for those violations. There were several minor aspects of it, like referring to the Taliban issue of authorization for foreign militants there. But the main terms were the Taliban were to control militancy. They, in return for that, the US would withdraw, and this was meant to be linked to a political process, which in the end never happened. So I think we can say that that this provided a cover for the US to withdraw from Afghanistan, but it did not provide the basis for either establishing peace in Afghanistan or for establishing a new political system. The US banked on the idea that the Taliban would go ahead with negotiations and reach a political settlement. The US did not react when the Taliban failed to do that.
Okay, vielen Dank. Lieber Herr bin Shah, möchten Sie zu der Frage der Herr Beheshti? Im Moment kann ich keine weitere Rückfrage zulassen. Sie haben ja schon 2 Fragen gestellt und Ihre Frage zur Pashtunisierung würde ich gerne, wenn er kann und uns zuhört noch, an Herrn bin Shah stellen. Können Sie darauf antworten?
Yeah, to be honest with you, this is not a specific area that I'm specialized at commenting, but my general comment would be that it's very tricky to see that whether it is the Pashtunization of Afghanistan or not. I think the history of the movement is very obvious, very documented. There's several books written how the movement actually started, and in the journey till now. And so if you look at the leadership level or at the cabinet, there is of course major figures coming from Pashtun ethnicity, but you can also see Uzbek or Turkmen or Tajik leaders in Taliban, from other non-Pashtun areas or non-Pashtun ethnicities as well. So totally, Pashtunization is an ideology also, and maybe Imran Feroz can comment on this very specifically, but ideologically as well, in terms of its manifesto, I would say they are more into religious lines of unity rather than ethnic lines of unity. At the practice or on the ground levels, what happens, I think that's something discussable, debatable, because not only with the issue of ethnicity and others, the on-ground reality and what's being observed by outlets or media or other channels, there's always a difference. There's always a gap on what exactly happens and what are the motives behind. So my comment I would be is probably I'm not the perfect person to ask this question, but I would definitely comment on what was said in prose to Dr. Semple as well, of the two annexes that we are still unable to read of the Doha Agreement. It is being said, widely reported, there were so many rumors and discussions about that there are certain annexes of the Doha Agreement, they are not made public. And if it is the case, so I think all Afghans and the international community and everybody deserve to see those annexes and those agreements made in Doha between Taliban, the United States, and the international community. Thank you.
Okay, ganz herzlichen Dank Ihnen. Ich habe jetzt noch 4 Personen auf der Rednerliste. Das sind Frau Posch, Frau Humaira, Herrn Sulfakar und Frau Schweizer. Und danach müssen wir die Liste auch schließen für heute Nachmittag. Wir haben uns dann alle eine ausgiebige Pause verdient, Zeit zum Abendessen und wieder neu Kraft schöpfen. Also, ich bitte um kurze Voten, kurze Fragen. Frau Posch, Sie sind die Nächste, bitte.
Okay. Do you mind if I speak English? Okay, thank you. But I would like to have, I would like Mr. Semple to understand what I'm saying. So I would like to speak English if you don't mind. Okay. I have a question concerning the possible influence of Western countries. Do you believe we do have a realistic chance to influence what is happening now in Afghanistan? After what you told us and after what we heard about the corruption that was already ongoing and yeah, what is happening now, I would like to know what you think about it. And then I have a question to Mr. bin Shah. One question I asked already personally was about the women in Afghanistan, which role they play in the economy and the impact on the economy that the new role of women has. And also, have you the impression, Mr. bin Shah, that drug production is being pushed by the Taliban in order to generate more financial means? So opium production, for instance, I've heard about this and I don't know what you say.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very
Shall I
much.
go first, you?
Michael Semple, bitte.
Yes. on the basis of what we've seen over the past 3.5 months, I think it is clear that Western countries retain significant ability to influence developments in Afghanistan. And really all that limits that, at least within reason, is their willingness to do so and their ability to coordinate amongst themselves. For starters, this is an impression that even the US team has obtained when they've sat with the Taliban in Doha after the collapse. They suddenly find that they perhaps have more leverage, more negotiating leverage than they had when the US was really keen to get out safely and the Taliban had all the cards. Now that the Taliban is in power in Afghanistan and is struggling because they have taken responsibility for 35 million people, and in no way are they capable of answering the demands of the population, suddenly the Taliban have a longer list of asks which they bring to the table. That's the first concrete evidence that we have of and it's almost like an increase in Western influence in Afghanistan. The second one is one which I hadn't quite anticipated in this to this extent, which is the response to the issue of recognition. We suddenly discover that it is incredibly important for the Taliban to get recognized, both by countries of the region and of the West. They have been surprised and disappointed by the fact that it has taken so long and they're not making progress. And that I found in my research, talking with Afghan actors around the country, they really take their signal from the issue of recognition. That on the one hand, the Taliban have had like conversations with people in the first couple of months when they said, we're sorry, we still have to extort money off you. It won't be for long because we will soon get recognition and then money will be plentiful and we'll be able to look after you rather than demand that you give us food or money to feed our troops. They have been tying their expectations to recognition. And so Afghans, non-Taliban Afghans observing this, they basically conclude that more changes lie ahead when they see that so far the world has withheld recognition from the Taliban. Definitely there are opportunities to influence events in Afghanistan. And that's where I say there's tremendous responsibility on the shoulders of all those who are involved in both the diplomatic and the humanitarian response. Because I believe that there are opportunities to reopen paths towards sustainable peace, which means a political solution, allowing a solution to the economic crisis, a durable end to the humanitarian crisis, and a kind of system in Afghanistan with Afghans can live with and which can deal with the international community. There are opportunities to get back onto that path. On the other hand, if we mishandle our dealings with Afghanistan and with the Taliban, it is possible that we will instead close those off and deter Afghans from hoping and striving for a system in which all Afghans feel they have a stake. So yes, there is now significant potential Western influence, but we have no guarantees that certainly the Western powers have not shown the statecraft either before the collapse of the Republic or since the Taliban came into power, which would show that they're actually ready to use that influence in a way that gives a better outcome. One can but hope and try to get people back on course for that. And I do think that from my conversations with hundreds of Afghans, that they really do aspire to something better than we see in Afghanistan today.
Herr bin Shah, zu der Frage der Rolle der Frauen auch in der Wirtschaft. Können Sie dazu etwas sagen?
I think one of the important things that we are still very not clear is the economic vision, irrespective of gender participation, you know. And we know that Afghanistan is, you know, in the last 20 years, there were efforts to include more women when it comes to workplace. And there were, you know, resources spent and you know, to some extent they failed for some other reasons. We're not talking about this, but right now access to work and the role of women in economy, we do not see any good movements. We do not see any good news on this. And I personally think that we probably would not hear any good news anytime soon. However, it affects economy, it affects families in Afghanistan, because women who are, you know, working outside their homes or have had their businesses as entrepreneurs, is somebody who would be independently working and creating jobs for others. And in the post-August 15, if there are restrictions and limitations, and there are significant restrictions and limitations to do general business in Afghanistan, let alone from a gender lens, they have been significantly affected. And so the families who are dependent on these women are significantly affected, and their kids and children, and so on and so forth. We yet to have to see and hear about the economic vision, you know, and unfortunately, the economic piece was never a major topic in Doha 2 years ago. It never had been a very significant topic during the negotiations in all these 2 years, whether the negotiations were happening between United States and the Taliban or the international community and the Taliban. Maybe just the big headlines, access to work, access to education, free media, so many other things, but there was no clear roadmap or a timeline as in how economy is going to be transformed or continued. And unfortunately, August 15 kind of, you know, gave that halt to the economy, and you know, there was another dispersion, I would say, after COVID-19 in Afghanistan, which has significantly affected work for both men and women in Afghanistan. And of course, women being the fragile part of the economy are significantly affected. To the question, you know, whether there is a pursuit to have more financial streams, I think this is very natural. I think this is very natural for any government or for any organization who has power or rule, you know, a certain territory, need financial resources to sustain, need financial resources to do so many things. And so the pursuit to, you know, decriminalize opium or legalize opium or, you know, sort of other products in Afghanistan, for example, hash or weed, there has been discussions, and we were surprised to know last week that the Ministry of Interior and the spokesman for Ministry of Interior confirmed having discussions with a German company to, you know, start working on how legally, you know, opium production can be converted into something, you know, useful, for example, medicines and so many other things, other usages that it can have. But unfortunately, you know, it requires a very sophisticated ecosystem to do that. And we can see that, you know, in the last 15, 20 years, even in the West, the US, the Canada, and other countries who have opened up their markets or their economies to, you know, recreational or medicinal marijuana or weed, you know, they first, you know, focused on the sophistication of the systems and mechanism and the regulatory environment. We simply cannot just go and open or start up a factory. So we have been hearing that there are efforts going on to, you know, diversify financial streams, and probably this is one of the pursuits that they would be making. And it's very natural, I would say, to do that. With the collection of revenues the corruption level, going low is true, but at the same time, just like Dr. Sample mentioned, there are other streaks and there are other incidents and events and reports coming out where we can see that we still have to deal with the challenge of corruption as a country and as a nation. So this is my 2 cents on your question. I hope I've answered. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank. Uns verbleiben leider wie so oft nur noch wenige Minuten. Deshalb möchte ich jetzt die 3 verbliebenen Rednerinnen und Redner bitten, kurz ihre Beiträge hintereinander weg zu sagen und dann Michael Sample und Sie, lieber Herr bin Shah, bitten, kurz nicht auf jeden einzelnen Punkt zu reagieren, sondern bitte zusammenfassend ein Schlusswort zu sprechen. Frau Humeira, bitte.
Miri, aber das ist kein Problem. Ich wollte einfach nochmal die Frage stellen, erstmal vielen lieben Dank für alle Beiträge. Wir haben ja sehr viel über die Analyse der Gründe der aktuellen Situation, über die aktuelle Lage gehört. Für mich ist aber wichtig, dass man jetzt auch mal in die Zukunft schaut. Ja, was können wir tun, um einmal als Afghanen in der Diaspora, aber auch als Zivilgesellschaft in Afghanistan, die Menschen dort vor Ort zu stärken. Ja, es geht ja um Rechte der Frauen, es geht um Bildung, es geht um die Chancen für die Wirtschaft. Wir können ja nicht nur hilflos zuschauen, sondern wir wollen gern was tun. Was können wir tun aus Sicht jetzt vielleicht von Herrn Sample, um einfach hier auch aktiv zu werden und die Zivilgesellschaft in der Community auch weiter zu stärken? Danke.
Ihnen vielen Dank. Herr Sulfaka, herzlich willkommen.
Ja, vielen Dank auch. Ich finde, das, was ich von Ben Shah gehört habe, bezüglich der Hilfe und die Notlage in Afghanistan, sehr wichtig, dass man versuchen sollte, möglichst bald andere Mechanismen zu finden, so akute Hilfe, so wie von der UNESCO für die Gehaltszahlung bei den Lehrern übernommen worden ist, dass man so Ähnliches bei WHO, also World Health Organization, für die Ärzteschaft machen soll. Eine Sache. Die zweite Sache, ein Sample, ob das die ganze Lage und die ganze fehlende Widerstand in Afghanistan gegen die Machtübernahme von Taliban, ob es nicht dadurch zu tun hatte, was auch die Taliban behaupten und auch was sich geändert hat, dass von ISAF, von der internationalen Hilfe oder Security von Afghanistan, die Mutation zu einer Besatzungsarmee wurde und daher auch die Reaktion der Afghanen. Danke.
Danke auch Ihnen und last but not least, Christine Schweizer.
Ja, guten Abend. Ich habe eine Frage an Herrn bin Shah. Nach Zahlen, die ich gelesen habe, waren ja bis zu 97% des Bruttoinlandsprodukts internationale Hilfe. Also Analysten sprachen ja von so einem Rentierstate, der praktisch kein eigenes Einkommen produktiv erwirtschaftete. Und meine Frage wäre, gibt es eigentlich, wenn man jetzt mal über den nächsten Winter hinausschaut, Vorstellungen, haben Sie als Ökonom vielleicht Ideen, wie das Land mittelfristig auf eigene Füße gestellt werden kann? Im Moment scheinen wir die Forderungen nur sich daran zu beschränken, dass die internationale Hilfe wieder aufgenommen werden soll. Und das, klar muss das jetzt auch sein, da würde ich zustimmen, aber es ist ja keine längerfristige Perspektive.
Vielen Dank. Dann bitte in der Reihenfolge als zusammenfassendes Schlusswort Michael Sample und danach Herr bin Shah.
Great. I think on the first question of the role of the diaspora, I think it's a very important and challenging question. I think it's by staying connected, staying active, asserting agency, and I would say demanding that there be a new Afghan national dialogue, which should be the foundation of the next phase of the peace process, trying to achieve a sustainable peace in Afghanistan, which of course is a very big meaning, not just absence of violence. So I say the simplest thing is articulate the demand for a national dialogue in which all key constituents of Afghan society will have a say and demand their participation in the next iteration of the political system. Now, in terms of the understanding the rapid collapse of resistance to the Taliban, I think that there are several factors to it, and we should be careful in the political conclusions which we draw from it. For the 2 to 3 years before the eventual collapse of the Republic, in the policy advice which I delivered to both the US and to the Afghan national government, I said that the Taliban were strategically committed to trying to take power by force, and there was little prospect of a negotiated peace deal before the US left. And therefore, I both proposed to the national authorities, Ghani's government, and to the US that there be a focus on the resilience of the state to ensure that the Afghan state was in a position to survive after the withdrawal and to create a new opportunity for achieving a negotiated settlement and peace after the Taliban found that they could not topple it. Now, of course, this didn't happen. It didn't happen in part because the US focused on getting out as quickly as possible. And in the run-up to the withdrawal, it weakened the Afghan security forces and undermined the authority of the Afghan government rather than boosting them. So I would say it was a disastrous failure of US policy which led to this outcome, rather than a decision by the Afghan population that they wanted and welcomed the Taliban. Along the way, those bits of Afghan politics, you could say the traditional commanders, traditional power brokers, who in normal circumstances would actually have organized the resistance to the Taliban, and whose own communities in many cases were demanding that they should do so. They had spent 20 years basically having their role curtailed and being told by the Americans that, oh, you do everything through the central government, that when the central government collapsed, essentially they collapsed too. And through all the process, as we went through the first half of 2021, when all this became foreseeable, basically nobody was prepared to change their approach. And if you follow even the last telephone conversation between Joe Biden and President Ghani, that Joe Biden actually was making a final bid that the Republican government should change their approach. Specifically said, that they empower your defense minister. The government did not change approach, and so a catastrophic policy delivered a catastrophic result. So I think that of course, people will be analyzing this for a long time, but I would broadly say it was policy failure by both the US and the government in Kabul in the critical period before the fall of Kabul, the completion of the withdrawal, which led to this outcome, not a popular welcoming of the Taliban or considering the ANDSF to be part of the occupation. Therefore, be very careful what we conclude from this outcome.
Vielen Dank. Dann noch bitte, wenn Sie mögen, zu Ihnen, lieber Herr bin Shah. Es gab ja auch noch eine konkrete Frage an Sie.
The first question was
kurze Bemerkung zum Schluss,
creative
bitte.
ways, basically coming up with alternative mechanisms and finding new ways and creative ways to channelize humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. I think this can be done, not with much difficulty, because we have technology, and now technology offers solutions where this money can be channelized to beneficiaries, organizations, individuals, communities across the country to start the economic process again. The economic cycle that seems to be at a halt can be restarted. At the same time, I think there's also a need for macroeconomic precautions as well. We have been hearing that one of the private banks is not doing well, and probably the financial health of the bank, one of the private banks, is going to be creating more challenges. And so it's not only about microeconomic lens that we have to see things, but rather from a macroeconomic perspective as well, because we cannot absolutely lose the achievements of the last 20 years when it comes to the economic system in Afghanistan, or the overall ecosystem for doing business in Afghanistan. It was not very strong, it was not very healthy. But at the same time, what we had achieved in the last 20 years in terms of the economic growth and others, I think we need to be very cautious going forward. And these creative ways are being discussed right now. I'm very happy that there are numerous organizations and individuals who are trying to come up with creative ways of channeling this fund. And there are many trusted organizations right now active on the ground and outside the country who are trying to do this. The second question was regarding GDP and how GDP was dependent on aid. I would like to respond to ma'am and humbly say that it was quite a big number. It was probably 70-75% of the GDP was dependent on foreign aid in recent times, and that makes a huge pie of the budget of almost every thing in the whole economic bubble that we should call it. And so when you cut off 75% of a bigger piece, I think the remaining would simply just crumble and would not sustain for quite a long time. But how do we look at the future? We should, I think, look at the future from an optimistic perspective. There is international pressure being built. Diplomacy should work more, coming up with creative and alternative ways, whether it's the issue of a national inclusive all Afghan government, or any political process that has to happen to continue the peace and walk and march towards the peace, the true peace that Afghanistan needs, and the prosperity and growth that Afghanistan needs. Taliban, initially, before even, it was not the only security challenge to Afghanistan. There is still a lot of security challenges to Afghanistan and to the region. And moving forward, everybody, every actor involved, whether internationally, regionally, locally, and nationally, have to consider every angle of the entire process. And I would request everybody to not forget economics, because economics cannot and will not wait for politics or petty politics to happen. So people are important, and their lives are important, and their lifestyle is important. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank nach Kabul. Dort ist es später Abend inzwischen, und wir entlassen Sie gerne in eine hoffentlich gute und ruhige Nacht, lieber Herr bin Shah. Vielen, vielen Dank, dass Sie hier bei uns waren und uns mit den wichtigen Informationen versorgt haben. Herzlichen Dank nochmal und alles Gute für Sie in Kabul. Alles Gute und herzlichen Dank aber auch an Michael Sample in Belfast. Ich hoffe, Sie sitzen dort oder wo auch immer Sie sind. Herzlichen Dank. Sie sind ja sehr viel unterwegs. Es war wieder großartig, Sie dabei zu haben. Das zeigen auch viele Kommentare im Chat. Ganz herzlichen Dank. Auch Ihnen einen guten Abend und an Sie alle. für das lange Ausharren und das Ertragen auch der kleinen technischen und personellen Probleme. Wir sind immer noch auf der Suche nach Frau Khafari. Ich denke, ich kann Ihnen morgen vielleicht sagen, was da unser Kontaktproblem war. Ich wünsche Ihnen jetzt eine gute Pause. Wir sehen uns hier wieder ab 19:30 Uhr.